It all started so innocently. The boy I had a crush on continued to appear in my life and disappear like a shadow in a night city. It was mysterious, even a little scary, but I tried not to pay attention to it, continuing to live my life. However, a year later, an unexpected message hit me like a bolt out of the blue. This message was from my neighbor, with whom we used to correspond frequently. 3 years ago, he was my friend, or so I thought. We discussed everything from music to movies, and even thought about spending some time together. But every time I suggested a specific day and time, he was silent, as if he evaporated into thin air. One day I even decided to take a step towards him. I made cookies and went to his door, hoping for a simple friendly meeting. He said he would be home, but when I came, there was no answer, just crickets. The next day he mentioned it as if nothing had happened, and I gave him the cookie. He said that he liked it very much, but something about his behavior remained mysterious. Over time, I realized that he was just taking advantage of my kindness. He would offer me a walk, but always made me wait, changed the time, or even canceled at the last minute. All this reminded me of a game in which I was a pawn and he was a player. But even after that, I couldn't completely erase him from my life. 2 years later, he moved. I wished him all the best and thought that would be the end of it. However, 2 months ago, he reappeared in my life as suddenly as he disappeared. He talked about how much he missed me, how he wanted to taste my cookies again, and started asking me to send him selfies again. I remembered all the times he had kept me waiting, his promises without any consequences. It was like going back in time, but this time, I decided to do things differently. I continued to talk to him, but this time I was in control. I kept postponing the dates we could meet and deliberately didn't send any photos. He was getting more and more impatient, but that didn't bother me anymore. I felt that he no longer had power over me. And so, 2 months later, today he sent me one last message. "That's cool then. I'm done being nice." I gave a thumbs up in response, blocked him, and that was the end of it. But is this really the end? It would seem that everything should be completed, but there was something in his words that left a coldness in my heart. After blocking his number, I felt relieved. Finally, I could move on without his presence in my life. But the joy was short-lived. After a few days, I started noticing strange things. At first, it was little things. An unfamiliar look on the street, a feeling as if someone was watching me, a slight tremor in the air when I left the house. I tried to calm myself down, convincing myself that it was just my imagination. But one night, everything changed. I came home late after a long day at work. As soon as I opened the door of my apartment, I felt something strange. It felt like someone had been here while I was gone. I checked all the rooms but found nothing. However, in the bathroom, the mirror was foggy, as if someone had recently taken a shower. I knew for sure that I left the apartment in the morning without any moisture. It couldn't be a coincidence. I started looking for clues. All locks were in place, no signs of tampering, but there was something barely noticeable, as if someone carefully touched my personal belongings. The feeling of anxiety increased. I realized that this is not just my paranoia. The next day, I decided to contact the police. I told them about the suspicious behavior of my former neighbor and about the strange things that happened in my apartment. The police accepted my statements, but unfortunately, they did not have enough evidence to open an investigation. I felt helpless, knowing something was wrong, but having no way to prove it. Over time, the strange events only intensified. I started receiving anonymous messages on social networks. They contained no words, only pictures. At first, these were ordinary photos of streets, parks, random places. But over time, these places became closer to my home. Once I received a photo of my apartment taken from the street. I was scared, but I didn't know what to do. I had no evidence that he was the one doing it. I decided to temporarily move in with my friend to feel safer. However, it did not help. A few days after the move, I received another message. This time, I was in the photo, leaving my friend's apartment. It was already too much. I realized that someone was following me all the time, no matter where I was. I had no other choice but to turn to a private detective. I knew the police wouldn't be able to act without concrete evidence, and I couldn't wait for something worse to happen. I needed answers, and I was willing to do whatever it took to find out the truth. The detective was a serious man with many years of work experience. He listened carefully to my story and agreed to help. The first thing he did was install cameras in my apartment to monitor for any suspicious activity. I returned home, hoping that this would help expose my stalker. A few days later, the camera caught something that made me go cold with horror. At night, when I was sleeping, a shadow appeared at the door of my apartment. She stood there watching me sleep. Then, without making a sound, that shadow disappeared. The recording showed that the doors remained closed and the locks were in place. How did this person get into the apartment? And why didn't I hear anything? The detective looked at the tape and said it could be someone who has access to the keys, or even someone who knows how to pick the locks. I felt trapped in my own home, not knowing who this mysterious stalker was. At this point, I realized that I could no longer ignore the situation. It wasn't just playing with someone who didn't respect my time. It was something much more serious, and I couldn't let it go on. After I saw the video from the surveillance cameras, I realized that this nightmare was just beginning. It was hard to fall asleep, knowing that someone might be around watching me in the dark. But the question that tormented me the most was, who could it be? And why is this person so persistently pursuing me? The next day, the detective returned with bad news. He found out that my former neighbor had recently returned to town. This information burned my heart with coldness. It turned out that he lived not far from me, just a few blocks away. This explained his easy access to my apartment and the ability to watch me. I tried to convince myself that it was just a coincidence, but all the puzzles came together in a single, creepy picture. My former neighbor, it seems, was no longer just a ghost from the past. He turned into something much more dangerous, a real threat. The detective advised me to increase security in the apartment. I changed all the locks, installed new, more powerful doors, and added additional cameras. But even after all these measures, the feeling of danger did not leave me. Every noise in the night, every shadow on the wall seemed suspicious. One evening when I got home, I saw something that almost stopped my heart. There were cookies on the table in the living room, exactly the one I once prepared for my former neighbor. But I did not remember taking it from somewhere or leaving it on the table. It was like a signal. I'm here. I know where you are, and I can come to your house anytime. I immediately called the detective. He arrived in a few minutes, but there were no signs of a break-in in the apartment. The cameras also did not record anything suspicious. It was incredible, as if my pursuer knew how to bypass all security measures. The next few days were a real test. I thought I was going crazy. I couldn't even trust my own feelings. Every time I went outside, I was haunted by the feeling that I was being watched. I even noticed that I saw the same car several times on different streets wherever I went. One day, returning home, I realized that I could no longer live like this. I called the detective and asked him to find this man. I wanted to meet him face to face, to understand what he wanted and why he was chasing me. I knew it could be dangerous, but there was no other way out. I wanted to put an end to this horror. The detective agreed and started looking for my former neighbor. But time passed, and there was no news from him. I felt that the situation was getting out of control and that every day only increased the danger. One night I woke up from a strange noise. It was a light knocking, as if someone had knocked on the window. My heart beat faster. I went to the window and saw a dark figure behind the glass. He stood there, motionless, watching me. It was like a nightmare, but this time it was real. I rushed to the phone, trying to call the police, but the figure disappeared as soon as I turned away. The police arrived a few minutes later, but found no traces. It was impossible. I definitely saw him, but he disappeared as quickly as he appeared. After that, I could no longer sleep peacefully. Every sound seemed threatening, every shadow dangerous. My world narrowed to my apartment, turning into a prison with an invisible guard behind the walls. My life changed in an instant. When I left my city, I hoped that escaping from the past could give me at least a temporary peace. But each new day in a new place only reminded me of how far this story has come. My former fears turned into a reality that threatened not only my mental state, but also my life. I settled in a small town far from my former life. The detective helped me find this place, assuring me that they would not find me here. But even here, in this quiet town, I could not feel safe. Any new acquaintance seemed suspicious. Every phone call made me anxious. My paranoia grew every day, but I tried to hold on. The detective was in touch from time to time, reporting on the progress of the investigation. It turned out that this group of people was active much longer and on a larger scale than could be imagined. They manipulated people through the internet, resorting to blackmail, intimidation, and even harassment. My former neighbor was only one of the executors, but someone was at the head of this organization, and it was this someone who turned out to be a real threat. One day I received a mail. It was sent anonymously, but inside was a small piece of paper with a photo on it. The photo showed me standing on the threshold of my new home. The picture was taken very recently. It meant that I was found, despite all the precautions. Now I was sure that my pursuers were closer than I thought. My decision was final. I could no longer wait and hide. It's time to act. I contacted the detective and said I was ready to meet with him to develop a plan. I knew it would be dangerous, but I could no longer live in fear. The detective came to my new residence the next day. We sat in the kitchen discussing the options. He proposed one idea that was risky, but could lead to a solution. We decided to set a trap for my pursuers. It was dangerous, but I felt it was my only chance. The following days were preparations for the decisive step. We carefully planned the operation. The detective involved his reliable contacts in the police. I went back to my old life, pretending to be back to my usual rhythm. We knew they would be watching me and that they wouldn't be able to resist acting when they saw the chance. My role was to create the appearance of vulnerability. I went back to my old house, allowed myself to be watched, even left a few tracks that might attract their attention. I knew it was playing with fire, but there was no other way to get them out into the open. One evening, when I returned home, everything happened so quickly that I barely had time to understand what was happening. The door of my apartment was open, although I definitely remembered that I had locked it. As soon as I entered, a figure appeared in front of me. It was a middle-aged man, dressed in dark clothes, with a gloomy look. His face was unfamiliar, but in his eyes I saw the same inhuman coldness that I had already seen in the eyes of my former neighbor. "Did you think you could run away?" His voice was quiet, but every word cut through me like a blade. I felt my heart begin to beat faster. It was a trap, but I didn't know if I could survive it. I tried to control myself, but the fear was almost paralyzing. "What do you want from me?" I asked, trying to buy time. "It doesn't matter," he said, stepping forward. "Only one thing is important. You will never run away again." At that moment, the door broke, and the police burst into the room. Everything happened as if in slow motion. The man tried to resist, but he was quickly neutralized. I stood watching him being rolled up and taken out of the apartment. My plan worked, but the price was high. The detective later explained to me that this man was one of the key players in that organization. They planned to use me as a tool to intimidate their other victims. But now that they were captured, I could hope that this nightmare would finally end. However, even after all this, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was left unsaid. If this organization was so big, was there any certainty that all of their members would be exposed? My story seemed to have come to an end, but deep down, I felt that the shadows of the past might return again. It's been a few months since the day it all ended, or at least I hoped it ended. I returned to my normal life, trying to put all this horror behind me. The police assured me that the organization was destroyed, and all its members were behind bars. Life was returning to its usual course, but the feeling of restlessness still lived in me, like a shadow that did not leave me alone. One evening, on my way home, I received a phone call. It was an unfamiliar number. I hesitated whether to reply, but something compelled me to hit the reply button. "Hello," said a man's voice on the other end of the line. He was calm, almost relaxed. "Who is it?" I asked, feeling everything inside me go cold. "Is it important?" the voice continued. "We just wanted to thank you." "For what?" I could hardly say these words. "For playing her part," he answered. "It was really interesting. But you know, every game has its own sequel, and you never know when it will start again." My heart was pounding, and my fingers were cold with fear. I understood that it was not just a call. It was a signal that this is not the end. "Who are you?" I asked desperately. "We're always here," the voice replied before the call ended. The silence after the call was deafening. I stood there holding the phone, feeling a cold sweat cover my body. The room became restless, as if the air itself was thickening with terror. I put the phone down and looked around. Everything looked the same as before. But now I knew it was just a mask, hiding something much darker. That call was a warning that the nightmare was not over. And while all the evidence pointed to the organization being destroyed, I realized they were just part of something bigger. That night, I could not sleep. I sat on the bed, listening to every sound, every rustle, every movement of the wind. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. And maybe he was always there, hiding in the dark. My story, which seemed complete, only opened the door to something much bigger and scarier. Whatever it was waiting for its moment. And I knew that this moment would come, but when and how remained unknown. The call echoed in my mind, reminding me that the real fear is not what we know, but what remains hidden. I could no longer relax. I could no longer feel safe, and that was the scariest thing of all, not knowing when the darkness would engulf me again.